Hi. In this lecture, we're going to wrap up our discussion of abortion. Our last two lectures were dedicated to two different takes on the abortion rights position. The first approach, which was defended by Thompson, granted a full right to life to the fetus, but argued that that right to life doesn't outweigh the woman's right to bodily integrity. The second, which was defended by Warren, tried to deny that the fetus has a right to life, or at the very least, that it has as strong a right to life as that of a person. This time around, we're going to move on to the anti-abortion side of the debate with the article An Argument That Abortion is Wrong by Don Marquis. As you'll see, Marquis tries to respond to both Thompson and Warren in a few different ways. So first off, a summary. As I pointed out already, Marquis is defending an anti-abortion position. He wants to argue that abortion is immoral, and for that reason, that it should be illegal as well. What he says is that abortion is seriously wrong except in certain rare cases. So what he's defending here is what Thompson calls the moderate anti-abortion view. What he suggests is that abortion might be morally permissible in the case of rape or when the mother's life is in danger. But in all other cases, he wants to say that it's impermissible. The way he proceeds is by asking what makes it wrong to kill an adult human being. If you've been paying attention at all for the last four lectures, you'll know what that means. He's looking for a criterion of moral significance, and in this case, one that explains what makes it wrong to kill. He considers two possible criteria. First, the criterion of humanity, and second, the criterion of personhood. According to him, though, both of those criteria fail. For that reason, he suggests another one instead, namely, the criterion of possessing a future of value. According to him, that's what makes killing human beings wrong. Killing them is wrong because it robs them of a future of value. Although Marquis himself is definitely not a consequentialist, this argument fits very well within a consequentialist framework. What he's saying is that killing someone has the negative consequence of robbing them of certain goods, namely, all of those goods that would come with continued existence. And since performing an abortion robs the fetus of a future of value just as much as killing an adult would, he concludes that killing a fetus is just as wrong as killing an adult human being. As I mentioned in the last lecture, this is a version of the argument from potential, but at the same time, it's a much more sophisticated version than anti-abortion activists often make. For Marquis, it's the fetus's potential to have certain experiences that are themselves good that's going to make abortion morally wrong. Alright, so here's Marquis' argument. He starts off by responding directly to Thompson's violinist thought experiment. Remember that in the violinist thought experiment, you find yourself hooked up to a violinist, the violinist has a fatal kidney disorder, and he needs to use your kidneys to keep himself alive. And the point of the experiment is to show that there are at least some cases where the right to bodily integrity outweighs the right to life. What Marquis says is that Thompson's violinist thought experiment shows that there are certain key symmetries between the abortion rights and anti-abortion arguments. So it shows that these two kinds of arguments are very similar in certain key ways. So let's look at these similarities. On the abortion rights side, Thompson grants that the fetus has a right to life. She just says that the right to life doesn't entail the right to use someone else's body. But then, on the anti-abortion side, they can say something very similar. They can say that the mother has a right to bodily integrity, but that the right to bodily integrity doesn't entail the right to end someone's life. So that's one way the two arguments are symmetrical. Both agree that the fetus has a right to life and that the mother has a right to bodily integrity, but each of them thinks that one of these two rights outweighs the other. This brings us to the second symmetry. Thompson might reply to all this that, in that case, the right to bodily integrity doesn't amount to very much. So, in other words, if the mother's right to bodily integrity can be overridden by the fetus's right to life, then you might as well say that she doesn't have a right to bodily integrity at all. But here again, the anti-abortion side can say something very similar. They can say that if the mother can choose to end the fetus's life at will, then that kind of right to life doesn't amount to much either. If the fetus's right to life can be overridden by the mother's right to decide what happens in her own body, then you might as well say that it doesn't have a right to life at all. So that's the second symmetry. What Marquis says is that it seems that there's a standoff here between different and conflicting rights, namely the fetus's right to life and the mother's right to bodily integrity. In other words, we reach an impasse here where each party has some right that they claim overrides the other party's right, and that makes it impossible to proceed any further in the argument. Now, according to Marquis, though, in a standoff like this between the right to bodily integrity and the right to life, it seems that the right to life has to win out. He says that the right to life is stronger than the right to bodily integrity. The reason for this is very simple. Although not having full control over your body for 9 months does involve some loss, and can even be highly inconvenient and unpleasant, it's much less of a loss than literally your entire life. The result is that if the fetus does in fact have a right to life, then it's going to outweigh the mother's right to bodily integrity. So the question then has to be, does the fetus have a right to life or not? In Marquis' view, this is the question that has to decide the abortion debate. So he's in agreement with Warren here. If the fetus does have a right to life, then abortion is wrong. And if the fetus doesn't have a right to life, then abortion isn't wrong. And if we're going to figure out whether it does or doesn't have that right to life, then we're going to need some general criterion on the basis of which a being does or does not have it. So what we're going to be looking for is some criterion of moral significance that's going to tell us whether or not the fetus has a right to life. Now, at this point, Marquis turns his attention to two possible criteria, namely humanity and personhood. These should both be pretty familiar to you by now, since we talked about them in detail in our last lecture on Warren. The criterion of humanity simply refers to being part of the species Homo sapiens, whereas the criterion of personhood refers to being an individual with a sense of self. Marquis points out that each of these two criteria is associated with a different argument in the abortion debate. In the first place, the criterion of humanity is often appealed to by the anti-abortion side of the debate. What he has in mind here is basically the same standard anti-abortion argument that we saw in both Thompson and Warren. You're probably pretty tired of hearing this by now, but in any case, the anti-abortion argument goes like this. All human beings have a right to life. the fetus is a human being, therefore the fetus has a right to life. Then it might add that the mother has a right to bodily integrity, but the right to life is stronger than the right to bodily integrity, and so abortion is morally impermissible. That's a very common argument, and it obviously relies on the criterion of humanity. On the other hand, the criterion of personhood is often appealed to by the abortion rights side of the debate. This is what we saw last time with Warren's argument, which goes something like this. Only persons have a right to life. The fetus is not a person, therefore the fetus does not have a right to life. So abortion is morally permissible. This argument was popularized by Warren, but it's become a mainstay of abortion rights activism ever since. Now, what Marquis says is that, at least on the surface, these arguments seem to be equally convincing, even though they're incompatible. And he says that this explains why the abortion debate tends to get so aggressive and so emotionally charged. Each side is convinced that it has an airtight argument. As a result, each side tends to see the other side as being either morally depraved or intellectually deficient. In other words, they'll often do one of two things. In the first place, they might ascribe morally dubious motives to each other. This is what I mentioned in the very first lecture, with abortion rights activists accusing anti-abortion activists of hating women, and with anti-abortion activists accusing abortion rights activists of trying to undermine family values. In the second place, they might dismiss each other as being uneducated or unintelligent, since they can't see how anyone could not find their argument convincing. This is what happens when people start to insult each other's intelligence when they can't come to an agreement. So those are the two criteria that are most commonly appealed to in the abortion debate, as well as the arguments associated with each one. According to Marquis, though, both criteria run into some crucial problems. Let's start with the criterion of humanity. Of course, it's obvious that the fetus does in fact satisfy the criterion of humanity, since it does belong to the species Homo sapiens. What isn't so obvious, though, is why all members of the species Homo sapiens should have the right to life. We saw exactly this argument last time with Warren. It just isn't clear that there's any connection at all between the species you belong to and the rights you're supposed to have. What we need to explain is why members of the human species, or at least certain members of the human species, should have the right to life. So that's the problem with the first criterion. It's arbitrary. Now let's move on to the criterion of personhood. Unlike the criterion of humanity, the criterion of personhood is not arbitrary. Remember, the most important trait associated with personhood is self-awareness, which just means the ability to understand oneself as an individual with a stable identity. Someone who is self-aware is usually going to have an interest in continued existence, and this explains why they should have the right to life. Not having the right to life would frustrate some of their most important interests. The problem, though, is that personhood is subject to scope issues. In other words, it excludes too much. This is very close to some objections that we've already seen a few times now. The idea is that if we restrict the right to life to persons in the sense of self-aware beings, then it's going to be very difficult to explain why some human beings, once again, children and mentally disabled adults, have a right to life. So that's the problem with the criterion of personhood. According to Marquis, neither criterion is satisfactory, and as a result, both arguments need to be abandoned. What we need is a different argument appealing to a completely different criterion of moral significance. So here's what we have so far. According to Marquis, the abortion debate has to be decided by the question as to whether the fetus has a right to life. If it does have a right to life, then abortion is morally impermissible, and if it doesn't, then abortion is morally permissible. He's considered two arguments for why the fetus does or does not have the right to life. The first appeals to the criterion of humanity and says that since the fetus is a human being, it has a right to life. The second appeals to the criterion of personhood, and it says that since the fetus is not a person, it doesn't have the right to life. The problem, though, is that both of the criteria appealed to in these arguments have serious problems. Although the fetus obviously is a human being, it's not clear at all why that's sufficient to give it the right to life. And although the fetus obviously isn't a person, neither are plenty of other beings who we think do have the right to life. So we need some other criterion. The way Marquis proposes to proceed here is to start by looking for an account of what makes it wrong to kill human beings in general. So we need to ask ourselves why we have a prohibition against killing in the first place. Once we've explained that, then maybe we'll be able to figure out whether killing a fetus is permissible or impermissible. The first thing that he does here is to eliminate a couple of options right off the bat. In the first place, he says that the wrongness of killing can't primarily be explained in terms of the loss to the victim's family and friends. This seems obvious enough. It's definitely true that killing someone causes emotional suffering to their family and friends. And that might well contribute to why we're so horrified by the killing of innocent people. But we don't usually think that that's the main reason why killing is wrong. We usually think that killing innocent people is wrong even if their entire family is already dead, and even if they have no friends to grieve for them. So what Marquis is excluding here is the possibility of providing some utilitarian account that would say that the main problem with killing someone is the harm that it causes to other people. In the second place, he says that the wrongness of killing can't primarily be explained by the brutalization of the killer either. To brutalize someone can mean a couple of different things, but in this particular context, it means turning them into a brute, so dehumanizing them or desensitizing them. We often think that killing someone robs us of some essential part of our humanity and makes us no better than animals. But once again, we don't generally think that this is the main thing that makes killing wrong. Killing innocent people would still be wrong even if, because of some character quirk, someone were able to kill without being desensitized in any way. What Marquis is excluding in this case is a virtue-ethical explanation of what makes killing wrong. As you'll see when we read Michelle Moody Adams on racism, some virtue ethics would emphasize the negative effects of immoral action on the actor's character. But Marquis wants to say that these kinds of effects aren't the main thing that make killing wrong. According to him, what makes killing wrong is the misfortune of premature death. It's the fact that killing someone ends their life before it would have ended otherwise. Notice that all three explanations here have to do with the consequences of the action of killing. The first one has to do with the consequences of killing for third parties like family and friends. Then the second has to do with the consequences of killing for the killer. And then the third has to do with the consequences of killing for the person killed. So Marquis is accepting that the main things that make killing wrong are its negative consequences. So we aren't dealing with a rights-based deontological perspective that says that some things are wrong independently of the consequences. At the same time, though, he's saying that there's one set of consequences that's more important than the others, at least in the case of killing. Namely, the consequences for the person who is killed. And the consequence for the person who is killed is that it ends their life prematurely. Marquis says that this is a misfortune. So, put simply, dying prematurely is bad for the person who dies. And the reason for this, according to him, is that it deprives them of future life. It deprives them of the life they would have had if they had lived their natural lifespan. According to Marquis, this is what explains why it's wrong to kill. It's wrong to kill because it has negative consequences for the person killed, namely that it ends their life early. And having your life ended early is a negative consequence, because it means that you're robbed of the life that you would have had otherwise, which would presumably have been good. Now, it's important here to take a second to clarify this point just a little bit. Marquis has argued that what makes killing wrong is that it deprives you of the life that you would have had. But it's worth asking what exactly life is supposed to refer to in this particular context. When we talk about life, we might just mean life in the biological sense. To say that something is alive in the purely biological sense is simply to say that it carries out certain biological processes that allow them to sustain themselves. Human beings are alive in this sense if there's still electrical activity in their brain that controls processes like circulation and respiration. Now, when Marquis says that dying prematurely deprives someone of life, he doesn't just mean that it deprives them of biological life. Being deprived of biological life isn't what makes dying a misfortune. This should be pretty obvious. Imagine two different scenarios. In the first scenario, you now fall into a permanent coma, and then you die in 20 years. Then, in the second scenario, you just die now. People in permanent comas are still biologically alive. Their brain continues to function, their heart continues to pump blood, and their lungs continue to take in air. What that means is that in the first scenario, you remain biologically alive for another 20 years than in the second. And yet it doesn't seem that the misfortune in the second scenario, where you die instantly, is any worse than the misfortune in the first scenario, where you fall into a coma and then die in 20 years. What this shows is that what makes premature death bad for us isn't just that it deprives us of biological life. Biological life isn't good in itself. Now, something else that we might mean when we talk about life is conscious life. To say that something is conscious is to say that it has some kind of awareness of the world around it that it experiences from a first-person perspective. Human beings who are in permanent comas are obviously not conscious. According to Marquis, though, the misfortune involved in dying prematurely isn't just that it deprives you of conscious life either. Once again, it's very easy to see this. Imagine a scenario where you have some terminal condition and all of your future life would be unbearable pain and suffering. In this kind of case, you would still be conscious, but it doesn't seem that death would be a misfortune. On the contrary, most people in this kind of a state would find it desirable to die, as we talked about in our lecture on euthanasia. So, neither biological life nor conscious life is enough to explain what makes it bad for us to die. Neither biological life nor conscious life is intrinsically good. And what that means is that losing them isn't necessarily bad. Instead, what is bad is that it robs us of what Marquis calls the future goods of consciousness. So, the goods that we have access to when we continue to be both alive and conscious. These are all the things that we get out of life, like the pursuit of our projects, the enjoyment of life events, the pleasures that we get from friendship, from community, from learning, and so on. According to Marquis, what makes dying prematurely bad is that it has the consequence of depriving us of the goods that we would otherwise have had. It's because it deprives us of these goods that killing is wrong. So, we were looking for a general explanation of what makes killing wrong in order to figure out whether killing a fetus is wrong as well. And Marquis has suggested that what makes killing wrong is that it deprives us of the future goods that come with conscious life. His question now is to ask what makes these future goods good for us. It's worth taking a second to explain his motivation here. Of course, everyone agrees that performing an abortion deprives the fetus of the future goods of consciousness. There's not really anything controversial about that. If the fetus is allowed to develop normally, it will presumably live a life that contains certain goods, and interrupting its normal development prevents that from happening. What is controversial, though, is whether it makes any sense to say that this is bad for it. A lot of people, like, say, Peter Singer or Marianne Warren, would say that being deprived of these goods can only be bad for someone if they already have an interest in them. It's bad for me as an adult to die because I am an autonomous, self-aware being who has an interest in continued existence, and dying frustrates those interests that I already have. The reason Marquis wants to ask what makes future goods good for us is that he wants to challenge this kind of claim. According to him, the explanation of what makes future goods good can't possibly be that we desire them now. The reason for this is that can't account for all of the things that we now believe that we're going to value, but that we actually won't. Similarly, it can't account for all of the things that we now believe that we won't value, but that actually we will. Let's consider an example. Teenagers don't know anything at all. They're basically idiots, and their priorities are all wrong. When I was a teenager, I couldn't see myself working any kind of a real job. I was convinced that I would hate any career path, so I just wanted to work a low-commitment, minimum-wage job that would give me the time to work on my own artistic pursuits. And, of course, I was completely wrong. I now have a career in post-secondary education that I absolutely adore. Now, I hope it's clear that this is an instance of something being good for me, even though I didn't have any kind of an interest in it at the time. According to Marquis, the lesson to draw from all of this is that the goodness of an experience seems to be completely independent of any interest that we might have for it. There are some things that are good whether or not we happen to want them, and then there are some things that we do happen to want that turn out to actually be bad. What Marquis says is that a person may be convinced that they'll have a valuable future and actually be wrong. So, for example, they may think they'll live a long and fulfilling life, but actually live a life of pain and suffering. Or else, they may be convinced that they won't have a valuable future and be wrong about that. For example, they may be convinced that they'll never get past some trauma or never get out of a state of depression when actually they will. In these kinds of cases, someone might value or not value their future life and be wrong. It's worth taking a second here to consider this a little further. What Marquis says is that whether our future is valuable doesn't depend in any way on whether we currently desire that future. Moreover, he says that we all already acknowledge this in all kinds of ways. The most obvious is in our attitude toward people who are suicidal. Almost everyone believes that the right thing to do if someone around them is suicidal is to prevent them from hurting themselves, to encourage them to seek help, and even to hospitalize them if need be. But how can we explain this? Someone who is suicidal does not currently have an interest in living. That's what being suicidal is. It's having a desire no longer to be alive. So, subjectively speaking, they consider their future life to be without value. And yet we still think that the right thing to do is to keep them alive nonetheless. And the reason for this is that we think they're making a mistake. Even though they don't subjectively value their future life, objectively speaking, we think that their future life actually will contain value. And for that reason, we think that being deprived of their future life would be bad for them, even though they don't currently have any kind of an interest in it. If we didn't think that life could be valuable even when you don't have an interest in it, then it seems that we'd be forced to say that if someone is suicidal, the right thing for them to do is to kill themselves. But we don't say this precisely because we think that their life does have a value independently of any interest they have in it. This sheds a lot of light on what Marquis is saying about the misfortune of death. What makes premature death bad for us is that it has the consequence of depriving us of a future of value. It deprives us of a future that we will come to value if allowed to live it. And it's that consequence that makes killing someone wrong. What Marquis says is that killing deprives someone of a future like ours. It deprives them of a future that contains all of the goods that come with conscious human existence. So this gives us the criterion of moral significance that we were looking for. Killing someone is wrong because of its consequences, and in particular, because it has the consequence of depriving someone of a future like ours, meaning of a future of value. What this means is that killing any being with a future of value will also be wrong. Now, I hope that you can see how this relates back to the question of abortion. The fetus obviously is a being with a future like ours. If it's allowed to develop, it will, in almost all cases, come to have a future that contains the goods that come with conscious human life. And that future is good for it, even though it doesn't value it now. According to Marquis, what this demonstrates is that abortion is seriously wrong except in certain rare cases. For him, Killing a fetus is just as bad as killing an adult human being, and for exactly the same reason. Killing it deprives it of the future goods of conscious life. Now, Marquis provides 4 independent arguments to try to show why the future like ours account is the correct one. So these are going to be arguments intended to show that the future like ours account is the most plausible explanation of why premature death is bad, and so of why killing is wrong. The first argument is that the future like ours account is the one that fits best with our considered judgments about the misfortune of death. So it's the one that best reflects what we would say is bad about dying if we took the time to think about it. Marquis says that this can be confirmed by asking people with, say, AIDS or terminal cancer about the nature of their misfortune. Presumably, someone who is dying of AIDS or of cancer thinks that it's bad for them to die. And if you were to ask them why it's bad for them to die, they would probably tell you that they won't get to experience certain goods that they would get to experience if they could live longer. So they might tell you that they won't get to travel like they'd always hoped to do, that they won't get to spend more time with their children or their grandchildren, that they won't get to finish the projects that they had hoped to undertake, and so on. These are all goods that they're going to miss out on by dying. So that's the first argument. The second is that the future like ours account explains why we think that killing is the worst crime. There are plenty of crimes that most of us would condemn, whether it's theft, vandalism, assault, or rape. But most people would probably say that killing is one of the absolute worst, if not the absolute worst crime that someone can commit. According to Marquis, the reason for this is that while plenty of crimes deprive us of some of the value in our future, killing deprives us of all of it. Vandalizing someone's property or assaulting them might cause physical injury, and it might cause emotional distress. That injury or distress is usually temporary, but it definitely can be permanent. Even when it's permanent, though, it doesn't rob us of all of the value in our life. Someone who loses a leg or who suffers from PTSD will almost certainly still find at least some value in life. In contrast, someone who dies obviously can't. They're deprived of all future value that life can offer. This explains why the penalty for murder tends to be so much worse than the penalty for other crimes. So that's the second argument. The third argument is that the future like ours account explains several of our intuitions about when it's right and when it's wrong to end someone's life. It explains the way we tend to think about these things in everyday life. Marquis lists 5 of these intuitions. The first one is that we don't usually think it's wrong to end the life of someone who we know is permanently unconscious. This comes back to the point we saw earlier about biological life. Someone who is permanently unconscious remains alive in the biological sense, but they don't have a future of value, since they're never going to be able to enjoy any of the goods that come with conscious existence. What that means is that ending their life isn't a misfortune for them. It isn't bad for them. As a result, we usually think that it isn't wrong either. The second intuition that Marquis points out is that we do usually think it's wrong to withdraw treatment from someone who's only temporarily unconscious. This one relates to what we said earlier about not currently having any interest in your own future. Someone who is temporarily unconscious, either because they're in a temporary coma or just because they're asleep, doesn't currently value their future, and yet we still believe that it's wrong to kill them. And the reason for this is that they do have a future of value. If they continue living, they're going to be able to benefit from the future goods of consciousness. Killing them would deprive them of those goods, and so it's wrong. Then the third intuition is that almost everyone thinks it's okay to give a patient drugs that are going to end their life as long as they face a future of constant pain. Even people who are opposed to active euthanasia usually think it's okay for a doctor to administer painkillers in so high a dose that it's going to kill the patient if the patient is in unbearable pain. That's actually the official position of the Roman Catholic Church, which, as I'm sure you know, is pretty strongly opposed to active euthanasia. And the reason for this, once again, is that even though someone who's in constant pain remains alive and conscious, their future is not a future of value. In other words, it isn't a future in which the good outweighs the bad. The fourth intuition that Marquis brings up is that we think that if certain non-human beings were to have futures of value, then we would say that it's wrong to kill them too. What he's doing here is showing that the future of value account avoids the problems associated with the criterion of humanity. Remember, the problem with the criterion of humanity is that it seems to be arbitrary. It isn't clear at all why simply belonging to the human species should make someone's life worth preserving. But the future like ours account isn't arbitrary in this way. If we happen to encounter an alien species that had futures that contained the kinds of goods that our future contains, then we would have to preserve their life as well. And the same goes for certain non-human animals, like, for example, the great apes. Then the fifth and final intuition is that we do generally think it's wrong to kill infants. Here, Marquis is showing that the future like ours account also avoids the problems associated with the criterion of personhood. The criterion of personhood would seem to imply that the only reason we shouldn't kill infants is that other people might want them. If you'll recall what we saw in Reagan, this would mean that we only have duties regarding infants, not duties to them. But we usually do think that we have a duty to infants not to kill them. And the reason for this is that they have a future of value even though they don't currently have either the rationality or the self-awareness to be able to have an interest in that future just yet. So that's the third argument for why the future like ours account is the correct account. It corroborates several of our moral intuitions about when killing someone is permissible and when it's impermissible. Then the fourth and final argument, which is actually related to some of what we just saw, is that the future like ours account avoids relying on any arbitrary criteria. Marquis actually explicitly says that his argument has the same form as Singer's principle of equal consideration of interests, which is a principle that the vast majority of philosophers find extremely convincing. Just as Singer claims that pleasure is good no matter who experiences it, and that pain is bad no matter who experiences it, so Marquis wants to claim that having a future of value is good no matter whose future it is, and that similarly, being deprived of a future of value is also bad no matter whose future it is. It's a misfortune to be deprived of a future of value no matter your race, sex, or even species. And what that means is that if it turns out that the lives of certain non-human animals involve just the kinds of goods that are involved in our lives, then it's going to be wrong to kill them too. Alright, so those are Marquis' 4 arguments for why his future like ours account is the best explanation of what makes it wrong to kill. And as I've already pointed out, if this account is correct, then it's going to turn out that abortion is seriously wrong. Just as wrong as killing an adult human being, and in fact, potentially more wrong, since the fetus probably has more of a future in front of it than most adults do. Now, before closing, he considers two possible objections to the future like ours account. Specifically, these are going to be two objections against the conclusion that the future like ours account implies for the case of abortion. The first objection is that the future like ours account would mean that contraception and abstinence are just as immoral as abortion. The argument here is that the future like ours account seems to lead to absurd results. An abortion rights advocate might point out that, according to Marquis, what makes it wrong to kill the fetus is that it deprives it of a future of value. But preventing pregnancies by abstaining from sex also results in fewer futures of value. Put it this way. If it would have been wrong for your parents to abort you 2 months after conception, because then you would never have gotten to have the life you have now, then it seems that it would also have been wrong for them never to reproduce at all, since you wouldn't have the life you have now in that case either. And this seems to be an extremely counterintuitive result, especially since it would seem to imply that any time that we aren't having sex, we're basically committing the equivalent of murder. Here's Marquis' answer to this. He says that his starting point was asking what made it wrong to kill a particular individual. What he wanted to know was whether the fetus belongs to the category of individuals that it is wrong to kill, and his answer was yes, because that individual has a future of value and killing it deprives it of that future of value. But before conception, there is no individual. As a result, there's no being that has a future like ours and that can be deprived of that future. This is why, according to him, it's wrong to kill the fetus, which is an individual with a future of value, but not wrong to obtain from sex or to use contraception. This leads to the second objection, which is very closely related to the first. The abortion rights advocate might object that Marquis' reply doesn't actually do the work he wants it to do. And the reason for this is that actually there are individuals that are deprived of a future of value whenever we abstain from sex and whenever we use contraceptives, namely the sperm and the ovum. The sperm and the ovum are individuals, and if the sperm is allowed to penetrate the ovum, then they will have a future like ours. Once again, this would lead to the absurd result that abstinence is the equivalent of murder. What Marquis responds in this case, though, is that although it's obviously true that the sperm and the egg can become an individual, there's actually no determinate individual before the moment of conception. So there's no single individual that you can point to and say, that's who's being harmed. He says that you can see this by the fact that there are multiple different options for who you could point to. Is it the combination of one particular sperm and the particular ovum that it would have penetrated? Or is it the individual sperm and the individual ovum themselves that are being harmed, like in some kind of a double homicide? Or is it the literal millions of potential combinations of any one given sperm with any one particular ovum? What Marquis says is that there's no way to answer this question. Any answer would be completely arbitrary. There's no one distinct subject of harm that you can point to. As soon as conception occurs, though, there is one distinct subject of harm, namely the fetus, and it has a future of value. Once again, this is supposed to explain why abortion is wrong, but abstinence and contraception are not. So that's Marquis' argument for why abortion is wrong. Let's summarize it very briefly, just to make sure that we're keeping everything straight. Marquis thinks that neither the standard anti-abortion argument nor Warren's abortion rights argument is very convincing. The standard anti-abortion argument appeals to the criterion of humanity, which seems to be completely arbitrary. In contrast, Warren's abortion rights argument appeals to the criterion of personhood, which seems to be much too exclusive. So we need a different account of what makes killing human beings wrong, and this is going to tell us whether it's wrong to kill the fetus as well. What we need is a different criterion of moral significance. And according to Marquis, this criterion is having a future like ours. Killing human beings is wrong because of its consequences, and specifically because it has the consequence of depriving the victim of the future goods of consciousness. It deprives them of the goods that they would come to value if they were allowed to continue to live. This is the account that fits best with our intuitions about why death is a misfortune and about why killing is wrong. And since the fetus does have a future like ours, that means that killing it is just as wrong as killing an adult human. Now, before we wrap up, I will point out that there are a couple of things that are a little odd about Marquis' argument. The point of the argument is to try to explain why it can be wrong to deprive the fetus of certain goods, even though it doesn't currently have an interest in those goods. While this argument might seem convincing on the surface, at the same time, it seems that it would have some very strange consequences. Probably the best way to bring this out is by considering Warren's cloning thought experiment from the last lecture. Remember, the cloning thought experiment asks us to imagine that it were possible to clone brand new human beings from our own cells. Now, of course, in this scenario, each one of our cells is an individual with a potential future of value, since each cell can become an adult with the same kind of experiences as any other human being. What that means is that Marquis' argument seems to imply that refusing to clone each of those cells is exactly the same as murdering an adult human being. If this seems too far-fetched, consider the following very similar example. The second time that I taught this class, I asked the students what they thought about Marquis' argument. And one guy raised his hand and said, "Wouldn't that imply that if ever we developed some kind of artificial intelligence software, not installing it on a computer would be equivalent to killing someone?" And yeah, that does seem to be correct. Imagine we developed some software that would make computers into self-aware beings with preferences, and that we installed that software onto a computer. This might not even be that far-fetched given the current state of AI research. In any case, if we did do this, then it seems that any computer with the software installed would become a being with a potential future of value. Now, if we never activate that software, are we doing the equivalent of killing a human being? This would seem to be an absurd result. And the reason this seems so absurd is that before we activate the software, it doesn't seem like the computer is even the kind of being that can be harmed. It's only once it gains capacities like sentience, rationality, and self-awareness that it becomes possible to harm it by depriving it of certain goods. I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture that Marquis' argument is an argument from potential, but that, at least on the surface, it doesn't make the mistake of saying that because the fetus is a potential person, then it's already a person. But after a bit more digging, it seems that this is exactly what it does. It seems that it has to treat the fetus as if it were already the kind of being that can be harmed just because it has the potential to become the kind of being that can be harmed. So, as convincing as the Future Like Ours account might seem at first glance, it isn't clear to me that it quite does the work that Marquis wants it to do.